Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second panel of the Navigating the Nuclear Future Symposium. My name is Gregory Koblentz. I'm director of the Biodefense program here. I'm also an associate professor in the Schar School. This panel is going to be talking about challenges and opportunities in the nonproliferation regime. Back in the early 1960s, President John F. Kennedy made a prediction that there could be easily 20 to 25 nuclear weapon states within the next few decades. Thankfully, that did not come to pass. Today, we have only 9 states with nuclear weapons, but that's still too many. And the fact that we only have 9 versus 20 or 25 is still cause for a great deal of concern. In particular, we have hotspots in East Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East, where the risks of the nonproliferation regime are real and growing. In the case of North Korea, even though they've suspended their nuclear testing and their tests of long-range missiles for now, they continue to improve those capabilities even without conducting tests. In South Asia, India and Pakistan are engaged in a nuclear missile arms race. And even more worrisome, they're actually shooting at each other now over disputes over Kashmir and cross-border terrorism. And so far, those conflicts have been conventional, but the nuclear specter looms large behind any kind of conventional crisis or confrontation that those two states have. And then finally, in the Middle East, we see after the US withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal that Iran is incrementally violating the limits of that deal. And other countries in the region, such as Saudi Arabia and Turkey, have become increasingly vocal about their interest in nuclear weapons based on what they see happening in the context of Iran. So to provide some perspective to the challenges, opportunities that we have the nonproliferation regime today, very proud to have this very distinguished panel here to provide you some perspective and some context. To my left is Sandy Spector, who is the director of the Washington, D.C. office of the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. He has several decades of experience working on nuclear issues, both in the US government and for various think tanks in D.C. To his left is Alexandra Bell, who is the senior policy director at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. Previously, she served as a senior advisor in the office of the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. And to her left is Suzanne DiMaggio, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where for nearly 2 decades she has led Track 1.5 and Track 2 dialogues with participants from Iran and North Korea in order to discuss key issues in relations between those countries and the United States. So I think these panels will be able to give you a very thorough and deep overview of the challenges and opportunities facing the nonproliferation regime today. And after their prepared remarks, I'll lead a little bit of a discussion, and then we'll open up for questions. So with that, Sandy.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Greg. And first and most important, my name is Leonard on your documents. My nickname has been Sandy for many years, and that's how I have been identified, which is great. I had a feeling that I may wind up crossing swords with Greg, who I believe I was his first professional boss in this field. So we'll see how that goes, because I think I have a somewhat more optimistic outlook about how nuclear weapons may be spreading. And I think when we speak about nuclear proliferation, that's the essence. In other words, are additional countries acquiring the ability to manufacture and deploy nuclear weapons. And I think as we look back, we'll find that there have been periods when the number of countries that were actually moving down that road was quite substantial. And I'll give you some examples. Whereas today, I would argue, and I think we can see, the situation is a good deal more stable, notwithstanding the problem of North Korea, which is very serious and most difficult to try to imagine reversing its nuclear capabilities. And with Iran now, the nuclear deal being so fragile that we don't know quite how that's going to transpire. So Greg suggested that I start as a jumping off point with an article I wrote in April of 2016. It's about 3.5 years ago. And then try to figure out what's changed since then and what it means. I think the implication of his comment was that so much has changed that your article may not be accurate anymore, and you may want to revise your thinking. But I'll stand by my view, and I think I left enough ambiguity in 2016 that I'll find a safe haven, I think, by the time we're done. Just to refresh, there are 5 original nuclear powers that got their nuclear arms the Chinese test was 1964, so it was 40s, 50s, 60s, the United States, Russia, Great Britain, France, China. And then subsequently, in the 70s and 80s, and 90s and 2000s, 4 other countries acquired nuclear weapons. Israel, probably in 1970, 72, it's not clear. India, Pakistan, both clearly had nuclear weapons by the late 1980s. And then most recently, and there was something of a gap, we're dealing with North Korea, which probably acquired its nuclear weapons starting in 2002, and now maybe has an arsenal of 60 or so. It's a little, I mean, no one quite knows, but that's maybe a useful figure of merit. And again, so that's 9 plus 1 on the verge, which is Iran. And we know that Iran knows how to manufacture everything they might need for nuclear weapons. Some of these facilities are operating at a very limited basis now as part of a freeze that we'll be hearing more about. And that's kind of the landscape as of the moment. So in the article of 2016, I said, I think we may have reached a proliferation plateau. In other words, if you take the 9 plus a half, let's call it, there doesn't seem to be another country in the pipeline that is taking concrete steps toward developing nuclear weapons. And that's a good thing. And maybe during this period, anticipating there will be another one of these days, we should use this pause to try to reinforce the existing rules against proliferation, the treaties, the inspections, controls over technology, and so forth. So I think to appreciate how the plateau actually does exist, you need to go back and take a look at the situation in the 70s and the 80s. And at that time, India hadn't quite, it had a test in 74, but it didn't build nuclear weapons for a while, so you had that movement. Pakistan, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, South Korea, Iraq, Iran, Taiwan, and North Korea all were taking concrete steps toward acquiring capabilities to manufacture nuclear weapons, usually in a context that was quite suspicious. Perhaps they had not, for example, joined the International Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which when you join, you renounce nuclear weapons and you permit comprehensive inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. All of these countries had taken concrete steps, and concrete isn't a bad term to use. They were building facilities. They were digging, some of them, test shafts, Brazil and South Africa. And these programs really were more than just rhetoric and wishful thinking and aspirations. There were actual things going on. And if you looked at, we can go country by country, but basically they were trying to build uranium enrichment facilities, maybe pretending they were going to be civilian the way the Iranians had, but in fact intended for military use. They may have been attempting to acquire plutonium extraction technology and to build so-called reprocessing plants where you could acquire that nuclear material. And those are the two that could be used as the basis for a nuclear weapon. And these were serious programs. I mean, take Argentina and Brazil, under military governments, not parties to any of the international treaties that would restrict nuclear weapons, building uranium enrichment facilities not under inspection. South Africa too, and of course they actually built nuclear weapons. So I guess I would say these were real non-proliferation challenges, not just talk. And I won't go with every single country, but there are others worth noting. I mean, Iraq in the 1980s had a very substantial clandestine nuclear weapon program, which was unearthed during inspections after the first Gulf War. You had Libya acquiring a uranium enrichment plant through an international network of clandestine technology sharing. That was surfaced in 2002 and 3, and it was blocked, and Libya gave those up. Iran, we've seen with its clandestine program, and most recently, I hadn't mentioned the country earlier, maybe I didn't mention Libya, Iran, but also Syria had a serious nuclear weapon program in the form of building a reactor that could produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. It was being built with North Korean assistance from 2001 to 2007. So this was the real McCoy. And one country, which we'll be hearing more about, Iran, I mean, you can see all of these elements, building the facilities, doing classified work on design of the bomb and the rest. And these programs are in different statuses, but all of them were quite disturbing. So fortunately, most of these programs were terminated. Not Israel, India, Pakistan, North Korea, but the other ones, either governments changed, or circumstances changed, or military intervention took place in the case of Iraq and Syria. And so, we wound up with some losses in the non-proliferation battle, but in other cases there were definite positive developments. So let's go back to 2016. So the article said, well, there are a number of countries that are expressing some interest in nuclear weapons. And I had 5. It was Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, South Korea, and Japan. And a lot of times, sometimes it would be the actual government, but other times it would have been a right-wing element within the body politic, which is what you would see in South Korea and Japan typically. But at the time in 2016, none of them were taking concrete steps toward actualization of these possible hopes for acquiring nuclear weapons. And it's true there were nuclear power projects starting in Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Egypt had aspirations there as well. And South Korea is a major nuclear energy country, but it doesn't have enrichment or reprocessing, so it would have to start that up. And Japan, as I went through the analysis, has significant quantities of separated plutonium, but this anti-nuclear vision, is very deeply embedded. And they have looked at nuclear weapons many times and had serious national debates, and always decided it was in their best interest to refrain, to come under the American nuclear umbrella, and to proceed on that basis. And so I guess the question is, how have things changed since 2016? And I'd say Greg alluded to some of these developments. We've got autocrats in Turkey, very fraught relations with the United States and with NATO, acquiring Russian anti-aircraft systems. So it's a very dicey environment. There's conflict in Syria, and definitely a deterioration in the overall security environment, no question about it. Movement toward acquiring nuclear weapons hasn't come out. Maybe it's occurring, but it's nothing that has appeared in the literature the way these other programs in the 70s and 80s and 90s did materialize and did have concrete aspects. Obviously, things are more difficult with Saudi Arabia. We've had a pronouncement that if Iran does get nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia will follow. That's okay, I understand that, but no steps as yet down that path. And so that's the right word. The pause that we had in place in 2016 is under stress, to be sure. And actually, when the article was written, the Iran deal had just come into force. It was working great, and there was a real freeze on the Iranian program. Now, obviously not so clear. So this could be a generator of additional interest on the Saudis or Turkish or others part to proceed down the nuclear road. And certainly North Korea is more of a danger today than it was 3.5 years ago. But this particular evidence of a real commitment to try to build the bomb still seems to be lacking. So that allows me, I think, to make the argument that I made in concluding my article, which is that, well, actually, I had some caveats in the article, and I better repeat them here. Obviously, there can be clandestine programs that we're not going to know about until there's some slip up and something comes out. A lot of the Iranian program was clandestine, the Syrian program, the Iraqi program, so that's a possibility. And we also have to realize that technology is changing. Additive manufacturing especially could be a factor that would allow small-scale development of some of these, especially enrichment facilities. So I acknowledge that that is a reason for caution, or an added reasons for caution. But I'd say that the overall situation has not changed that much from the earlier period. And so now is the time to take some steps to reinforce the regime, one of which might be, for example, that nuclear commerce should only be, civilian nuclear commerce should only be allowed when you have the so-called additional protocol, which is an enhanced level of inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency. So you'd like to have that in Saudi Arabia. They have hesitated, but I think we'll probably see them accept that in the end. The other countries, Egypt sort of to the side, because I don't think that's a serious effort at all. I think the other countries do have the additional protocol in place. We should make illicit procurement of goods for nuclear weapon programs, which is always the first telltale sign. That should be an immediate trigger for international response. And I'd say the sanctions tools that we've been using against Iran and North Korea are pretty powerful. They may be difficult to deploy against American friends, but they have now, they're out there. And so the next country that imagines taking a step down the road toward nuclear weapons is almost certain to be discovered sooner or later. And it may come up against these very powerful tools that are being used in the case of North Korea and Iran. So I guess the proliferation picture is not a pretty one, but things have been worse, and they've been much worse than I think what we're seeing today. So thank you.
Your choice.
Okay.
Okay. Good.
If you guys don't mind, I'll sit. Thank you, and thank you so much to Greg and to Ellen and everyone here for inviting me to be a part of this symposium and here at the Charter School today, and I'm honored to be on this panel. You've just heard a big picture overview on nonproliferation challenges from Sandy, so I'll go into a little bit more specifics about how the United States has been dealing with the nonproliferation challenges we're facing currently with North Korea and Iran. In a nutshell, things aren't going so great. And let's start with North Korea. I actually just got back from South Korea last week. I'm happy to talk about my trip to the DMZ and the meetings I had there during the Q&A. So just a little background. When President Obama left office in January 2017, he told President Trump that North Korea would be a pressing matter that deserved his attention, that required his attention. And it got attention, all right, just sort of in the form of fire and fury and rising tensions throughout 2017. We really did seem to be on a path to war when a strange confluence of events took place. And I think it's important to draw out how sort of these things don't necessarily happen the way you plan, but when they come together, you have to grab the opportunity. So first, President Park, the former president of South Korea, was sort of driven out of office due to corruption issues that had nothing to do with anything, North Korea related. Next, President Moon comes into power. He and his party much more predisposed to looking for a solution to the tensions with North Korea. And then the Winter Olympics happened, something that had been determined years in advance, but provided this strange opportunity to pause the tensions that were steadily on the rise. And then we had an American president in office who generally has eschewed the standard operating procedures when it comes to foreign policy. And he decides to throw convention out the window and agrees to meet with Kim Jong-un. For those of you who don't know, a direct meeting with the US president had been the goal of the last 3 leaders in North Korea. And it's something that the US government had withheld as sort of a thing that we would give out when we got something in return. I found out, actually, I was on the elliptical at the gym, and they announced it on the news that I was watching, and I basically almost fell off the elliptical because I couldn't believe it. I might have cursed a little bit as well, and ran home, and I was like walking my dog around the park, fielding interviews of people being like, "How did this happen? This is unprecedented," and I might have not given the president that advice, but once he decided to do this, I was like, great, go, run with it. You've broken down this sort of idea that we couldn't meet with the North Korean leaders, so let's go and get a deal out of this. And whatever just motivated the president to decide to make this step, he had completely changed the game and perhaps even clearing the path for some major progress. Unfortunately, it's now been over a year since the Singapore summit, about 9 months, 8 months since Hanoi, and we really haven't gotten anywhere. And the lack of progress is sort of maddening in the sense that the whole point of doing something big and bold and different is to be able to provoke change. The United States now finds itself in a pretty similar place to where it was, where Washington and Pyongyang are talking right past each other, and the North Korean nuclear arsenal is continuing to advance quietly. They're not testing weapons. That doesn't mean they can't advance the program. So the clock's ticking, and there are a number of issues that are really standing in our way. First, we lack a shared definition of what denuclearization means as it applies to the Korean Peninsula. There's no agreement on which North Korean facilities and installations will be made available for the purposes of verification and for how long. There's no understanding about when or if North Korea will rejoin or join international agreements like the Nonproliferation Treaty, like the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention. All of these steps need to be taken. There's also no clear picture of how U.S. military exercises and assets in the region will be altered or withdrawn. And there's been little progress, unfortunately, about a formal end to the Korean War. Just in case you know, we're still actually in the war that we were in 1952. And while it seems like a formality to actually, sort of cross that off the list, it is something that's particularly important to the North Koreans and the South Koreans. So where should the Trump administration go? First, the president would do well to kind of separate his unorthodox feelings for Kim Jong-un from the security threat that North Korea poses to its neighbors and to the world. Personal rapport is undoubtedly important to any negotiation, but directly connecting this personal relationship that he thinks he has to this complex and very historically fraught relationship we have is sort of bordering on reckless. And that's really because by making it personal, President Trump could perceive a hard line from Chairman Kim as sort of a rejection of his friendship. And, unfortunately, then we might see that hell hath no fury like a president scorned. And second, the United States needs to refrain from scheduling any other leader-level summit until we actually have something to formalize, something substantive to formalize. It doesn't necessarily have to be a nuclear agreement. We could formalize the end to the Korean War. But there really needs to be something to show for another summit, beyond the pomp and circumstance. And to keep that process moving forward, I think the president needs to make it very clear that Secretary of State Pompeo and his special envoy, Steve Biegun, speak for him and are able to negotiate on his behalf. Right now, there seems to be an idea that nothing really being exchanged matters until Trump himself is involved, and he's very busy. He needs to empower his diplomats. Third, the president also needs to empower all of the other people who work on a nuclear deal, and that's diplomats, lawyers, technical experts. They have to go about this slow and tedious process of hammering out concrete concessions from both sides. And the U.S. negotiating team needs to establish and stick to the clear incentives that they're willing to put on the table to make North Korea more likely to take a deal. The sheer volume of this suggests that an incremental approach is best. I know it's not as exciting as a grand bargain, but really our historical precedent has shown you take these slow steps, you build the confidence, and then you can get to more. We didn't, with the Russians, we didn't start with a legally binding, verifiable strategic arms reduction treaty. We started really simple. One of our first agreements was the 1973 Prevention of Nuclear War Agreement. That was as simple as the US and Russia agreeing on paper, if we think we're getting into a nuclear war, we'll call each other and say, hey, we think we're getting into a nuclear war. It's a pretty basic premise, but that's where you start. You don't start with these very technical, elaborate negotiations and get them all at once. You've got to work through the process. Both parties need to realize, time is not on our side. The longer this process goes out, the less likely it is that it's going to go in the right direction. An audacious move may have started this process, but regular old plotting diplomacy is the only way forward. And speaking of regular old plotting diplomacy, that's the only way forward with Iran, too. As much as it may pain the president, there's really no way other than a deal that looks very similar to the JCPOA to deal with our problems with the Iranian nuclear program. Just a quick back swing on that. I think it's always important to remind people that Iran's first research reactor came from us. We provided the help to the Shah of Iran. Iran actually joined the NPT in 1970. After the revolution, the program actually lay dormant for a number of years, didn't seem very interested in it. And then after the Iran-Iraq war, you started to see a re-emphasis into this. And so it was a slow process. Suspicions about the nature of the program started to grow. The US worked with the Security Council to lay out a number of resolutions. I grew up in North Carolina, and there's really only one bar in my town, and I see the folks from my high school. And some people occasionally say, well, who are we to tell Iran not to get a nuclear weapon? We have nuclear weapons. I'm like, we didn't tell them anything. They signed an agreement back in 1970 saying they wouldn't get any. And that's the legal basis on which we're drawing. We're not telling them to do something. We're asking them to live up to their commitments along with the rest of the world. So tensions go up during the Bush administration. Obviously, the Bush administration was entangled in several other conflicts in the region. There was a lot of concern that Iran might be a third. Thankfully, that didn't come to pass, but it didn't, deal with the problems that we were having. There was a very maximalist position where the U.S. wanted, a deal on its terms and wasn't willing to negotiate. Obama came in, made it clear that he was interested in a deal. Ahmadinejad was the leader at the time, not interested in a deal. But again, strange confluence of events take place, and you take advantage of it. When Rouhani took office, we saw the U.S. administration saw an opportunity to maybe go and make some progress on this front, and it worked. The P5+1, which was U.S., U.K., France, Russia, China, Germany, and the EU, got together, put together the most comprehensive and intrusive non-proliferation deal in history. Cut off every path Iran could take to a weapon. Was it perfect? No. There is no perfect in diplomacy. This is an art, not a science. And not only can you not make a perfect deal, deals once created don't just exist on their own and you don't have to tend to them. You actually have to actively keep deals together, actively watch them, make sure that things aren't falling apart, improve things when you can. It's a tedious, again, process, but that's how you make things work. Unfortunately, when President Trump was elected, no amount of reason could persuade him that the Iran deal was worth preservation or subsequent augmentation. So today, we're kind of back at square one. Saying you want a newer, better deal and being capable of achieving such a deal are two different things. And it took us years, near perfect political conditions, and some of the most accomplished nuclear policy diplomats in State Department's history to create the Iran deal. It is not an easy thing to do. And that said, we have the technical experts available. The problem is, again, you have to empower those technical experts to go make a deal. They have to be empowered by the White House to go and hammer out these details. You can't do foreign policy via tweet. And adding to the complication is many of those technical experts we have available in the government are sort of diverted into getting a deal with North Korea, potentially trying to negotiate a trilateral deal with the US and Russia. There are only so many of these people to go around. We really have to think about what we want first, what's most important to us, how can we move forward with sort of the biggest problems facing us, and while not letting the other things sort of fall off. For a time, my European counterparts indicated a general belief that Iran was going to try to hold on, potentially wait for a new administration to come in. Unfortunately, the pressure, I think, has proved too much. The deal is starting to fall apart, sort of all around us. Rouhani, though, recently, this week up in New York, said that maybe they would be interested in coming back to the table. Unfortunately, there was a meeting was not had at any level between the U.S. and Iran, as far as we understand, and seems, again, time to be ticking away. Political pressures are growing, and we're not going to sanction our way out of these problems. We're not going to missile our way out of these problems. The only way we're going to solve this problem is to get back to the table. For the purposes of a new deal, we need to deal with the nukes first. I know the ballistic missiles are a problem. Their destabilizing behavior in the region is a problem. The nukes are the biggest problem. You take them off the table first, and then you start to work for the next. And any new deal would necessitate not getting into another war in the region. That seems like a common sense approach to dealing with this, but unfortunately, the possibility of conflict in the region seems to be growing. I'll also note that leaders in Tehran and Pyongyang are closely observing the disparate approaches that the Trump administration is taking to both of these challenges. The inconsistencies are not lost on them, which makes this all more complicated. I'll end on a positive note, though. We can make deals, good, working, lasting deals. We know how to do this. We've already accomplished through sheer force of will an 85% reduction in the global nuclear stockpile. We have expertise and lessons learned and existing frameworks on which to draw. We are capable of doing this. We just need to be patient and persistent, and we need to compromise and be willing to see that a win-win deal in both of these situations is really the way that we accomplish what we want to accomplish, which is protecting the American people and our allies. And I know this is all hard, but I'd like to think that America has never been afraid of a challenge. So yeah, I think we just need to go forward and do it. I'll stop there, but I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. I'm Suzanne. It's such a pleasure to be here at George Mason. It's my first visit to the campus. And I'd like to especially thank Ellen for inviting me here today. So for my presentation, I'm going to draw on insights gleaned from informal, unofficial discussions with Iranian and North Korean officials and experts in an attempt to shed light on how they view their national security priorities and strategies. I'll also assess the prospects for diplomacy related to their respective nuclear programs. Before moving ahead, I think it's worth remembering that the cases of North Korea and Iran are quite different. Oftentimes they're lumped together. But as an American who's had the rare opportunity to travel on multiple occasions to both countries, I can attest firsthand that they are very different countries with very different governments, very different economies, very different societies. For the purposes of today's discussions, I think it's particularly important to note that North Korea possesses nuclear weapons and Iran has never crossed that threshold. Also, Iran is a party to the NPT and North Korea withdrew from the treaty in 2003. So I'll begin with North Korea and the current state of play. Alexandra already expertly laid out where we're at. Let me just add a couple of things. We're now 7 months on from the Hanoi summit. This was the second summit between Kim and Trump. It was a lackluster outcome. We then had a third encounter at the Korean border. I call that the DMZ handshake. And we thought that there would be some progress. There was an agreement at the DMZ to restart working level talks. Secretary Pompeo said at the time these would happen in 2 to 3 weeks. But here we are now, 3 months later, and these meetings have not yet materialized. But that doesn't mean the North Koreans haven't been busy. They've been launching a series of short-range ballistic missile tests. In this mix, they rolled out several new weapons programs, including a short-range missile that appears designed to evade US and South Korean missile defenses. They also unveiled a high-tech submarine that is probably capable of carrying submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And the Defense Intelligence Agency recently estimated that North Korea has produced enough fuel for roughly 12 new nuclear weapons since the summit in Singapore. Doesn't mean they've produced them, but they have produced enough fuel to do so. So to sum up, although the tensions have dissipated and remain largely under control, there has been no concrete progress since President Trump and Kim Jong-un began the exchange of meetings and the exchange of love letters. In fact, the North Koreans have continued to advance their capabilities throughout this period. And it's also important to note that the one area of progress that we had since the Singapore summit, and that was cooperation on the return of US war remains, has been halted. So let me move on to the view from Pyongyang. I'll focus on 3 key points that the North Koreans have relayed that I think carry important implications for US policy. The first is the US as an existential threat to regime survival. The North Koreans see their nuclear weapon and missile program as the only reliable way to deter US aggression against them, the only source against regime change. They have concluded that the United States will not attack a country that has nuclear weapons plus the means to deliver them. They point to the examples often, every time you see them, of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and to a lesser extent Saddam Hussein in Iraq as cautionary tales that they will not repeat. The second point is the rejection of the Libya-style approach. North Koreans have dismissed the Trump administration's approach to talks, which insists that the North Koreans fully denuclearize as well as give up their missile program, their chemical weapons program, and their biological weapons program before they can receive any concessions. They say they will not agree to such an approach that provides A, no security assurances to safeguard the regime, and B, no opportunities to address their economic challenges early in that process. Instead, they're looking for a step-by-step process that will lead to a fundamental change in the US-DPRK relationship. More specifically, a phased approach that incorporates political, economic, and security measures toward the establishment of what they call a peace regime. The third point are the lessons they're learning from the Iran nuclear deal. They're paying close attention to how the Trump administration has violated that deal, and they're drawing negative lessons. The message they have taken from it is even if you abide by your commitments, the US can still renege and violate the terms of the agreement. They also have concerns about issues of irreversibility. The US commitments outlined in the Iran deal were temporary and easily reversible, while the Iranians carried out commitments that can be viewed as irreversible, such as disabling their plutonium facility in Arak. That would require, to rebuild it would require millions of dollars and years. Following the Iranian experience, the North Koreans appear reluctant to take any similar steps that would be difficult to reverse. Now, the prospects for diplomacy with North Korea, given these perspectives, it's clear to me that the Trump administration's maximalist negotiating stance towards North Korea is deeply flawed. Pyongyang's threat perception will never allow them to accept an approach that requires the wholesale abandonment of their nuclear program up front. The Trump administration's refusal to consider concessions, such as limited calibrated sanctions relief as part of the negotiation process is a miscalculation and an obstacle to testing diplomacy. There is some good news. I believe that the elements of a potential interim deal were left on the table in Hanoi, providing a clear basis for continuing talks. The North Koreans' offer to permanently end and codify the nuclear and missile testing is significant. We should grab that offer. The offer on Yongbyon, one of their facilities, and their willingness to shut it down in the presence of US experts would help us better understand their program and their overall capacities, and opening a US liaison office in Pyongyang would dramatically address the lack of steady channels of communications. But here's some bad news, and Alexandra referred to this. Trump's unorthodox personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un has brought about a dramatic reduction in tensions. That is true, but it's really a page out of Trump's playbook we have come to expect. Create a crisis situation, then take credit for solving it, even though very little, if anything, has been resolved. It's President Trump as the arsonist and then the firefighter. So the limits of this approach have become very clear to me. Following the pageantry of 2 summits and the DMZ handshake, we now need serious diplomacy to manage the uncertainties ahead. Now I'll turn to Iran, and Alexandra talked about the nuclear deal, so I won't go into too much detail on that, but I really want to make one point that it placed Iran under the strongest nuclear inspection system ever negotiated. The real innovation of the Iran deal, in my view, is the unprecedented international verification provisions, some elements of which, if we stuck to the deal, could have been used as a model for North Korea or as a precedent. The deal was forged by President Obama. I think that was its downfall. It was one of his key foreign policy achievements. And President Trump called it the worst deal ever made. He withdrew from it. He fulfilled that campaign promise. He's reinstated sanctions against Iran and has brought the US out of compliance with the deal. To be clear, this is significant because it was us, not Iran, that reneged on its commitments originally. Now the view from Tehran. Here I'll focus on 3 points that I think the Iranians have conveyed that carry important implications for US policy. First is US policy incoherence. There's confusion, deep confusion among Iranian officials about the objective of the US's maximum pressure policy. They see the withdrawal from the deal as an all-out war on their economy, and the impacts have been serious. It has plunged the Iranian economy into a deep recession. But beyond this, what is the objective, they ask? Is it aimed at getting them to renegotiate the deal? Or is it the fulfillment of Secretary Pompeo's 12 points? Or is it regime change? Depending on who you talk to in the administration, you do get a different answer. While President Trump talks about getting a better deal, he has failed to put forward a plan B of how to get there. As such, his calls for talks are seen as disingenuous because the JCPOA provided a channel for dialogue between the US and Iran. When the US withdrew, it severed that channel. The second point is what I call from strategic patience to maximum resistance. And it's important to remember that for the first year after we withdrew from the deal, the Iranians maintained their commitments to the deal. And this was verified by the IAEA consistently. They called it their approach during this period strategic patience. They continued to fulfill their deals while looking to the Europeans to find ways to allow them to receive the economic benefits that the deal promised. In the absence of any progress, they moved to an approach of maximum resistance. They've taken a number of steps that have gone beyond their commitments to the deal now. But what's important to remember is every step they've taken is easily reversible. Also, the IAEA still maintains a 24/7 presence in Iran. This indicates to me the Iranians are not really excited about going outside of their commitments. They feel forced, and it's a way to put pressure on the Europeans to step up and deliver on some of the economic benefits. In addition to moving away from the nuclear commitments, Iran has sought to exert pressure on Europe and the international community by threatening shipping and trade in and around the Persian Gulf. The message here is if we can't sell our oil, no one will sell oil in peace. This campaign has largely paralleled Iran's steps on its nuclear commitments. It's included a standoff with the United States, an extended tit for tat with the UK, broader provocations aimed at international shipping, and most recently, the US and others have placed blame on Iran for recent strikes on Saudi oil facilities. The third point is reconsideration of nonproliferation. So the US withdrawal from the deal has led to a debate within Iranian policymaking circles over whether Iran should resume a full-scale nuclear program, including an immediate withdrawal from the JCPOA and possibly withdrawing from the NPT. The difference in how the Trump administration is approaching North Korea and Iran is helping to fuel this debate in Tehran. In a recent interview, Secretary of State Pompeo made the point that the US is talking to North Korea without preconditions and not Iran due to the fact that Pyongyang has nuclear weapons. This is the message that the Iranians are receiving. There are no indications that Tehran is moving in this direction, but we should be very concerned that US policy is causing some in Iran to rethink their commitments to the NPT. Now, looking ahead to prospects for diplomacy with Iran, I think I see two paths to potential dialogue between the Iranians and the US. The first is diffusing tensions and a return to talks. The Iranians would like to arrive in an acceptable economic package with the Europeans in exchange for their return to full compliance with the JCPOA. The Iranians have been looking for creative ways for Trump to claim victory while avoiding an actual renegotiation of the deal. In other words, a rebranding of the existing deal in Trump's name. The French, the Japanese, the Iraqis, Qataris, and others have been playing intermediary roles to help jumpstart this process. And as we know, President Trump has long sought a meeting with President Rouhani, but the Iranians are requiring the lifting of sanctions that were reimposed before such a meeting can take place. In other words, the photo op will come after an understanding is reached, not before. France's President Macron has been particularly active. He's put forward a plan that would extend a $15 billion credit to the Iranians if they come back into compliance with the deal. This credit line is meant to compensate Iran for oil sales disrupted by US sanctions. This proposal would require the Trump administration to issue limited waivers on Iran's exports of oil, of course. It would be a major departure from the maximum pressure campaign, and so far it appears that the administration has been willing to do this, or at least more precisely, we haven't been able to get the sequencing right. An added enticement is the Iranians have said that they would commit to enhancing nuclear inspections through the ratification of the additional protocol now rather than waiting till 2023, which is what it's required to do in the deal. The second area, a path for diplomacy I see with the Iranians are opening talks on prisoners. This is not related to nuclear issues, but I think it's important to know that the Iranians quietly indicated that they were ready to proceed with a humanitarian dialogue focused on the exchange of prisoners in September 2018, over a year ago now. This interest in starting negotiations was reiterated through a number of channels over the course of the past year. It's worth recalling that the engagement between the Trump administration and the North Koreans began exactly this way over the talks of the prisoner issue. So I'll just conclude by saying I think given the perspectives that I've outlined, I think it should come at no surprise that the Trump administration's approaches to both the North Korean and Iranian cases are not working. Simply put, they are not grounded in reality. In the case of North Korea, the leader-to-leader approach between Trump and Kim has certainly been a breakthrough, but as we are learning, this breakthrough will only take us so far. Given still tenuous communication channels and the high stakes for both leaders to deliver, we could slip back to a ratcheting of hostilities quickly, including once again spiraling toward military confrontation, either by design or probably more likely by accident. It's clear that we need a coherent strategy and pragmatic goals to avoid such a situation. And then finally, in the case of Iran, diplomacy worked. Major powers came together to peacefully resolve an issue they all viewed as a potential threat, Iran's nuclear program, a potential weapons program. Following our withdrawal from the deal, as many predicted, we are now locked in a cycle of escalation that could lead to violent conflict. Keep in mind, we have no official relations with Iran. There's no existing deconfliction channel, so you can see how this escalation could evolve. In my humble opinion, I think we should return to the JCPOA, join our allies in an effort to reach a similar follow-on deal with the Iranians that perhaps would extend the sunsets and other things. And also, very importantly, pursue negotiations with them on a range of issues that we have that are undermining U.S. interests, particularly in the region. I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to your questions and comments.
Well, that was really excellent, both overview of the nonproliferation landscape as well as some really interesting, insightful deep dives on Iran and North Korea. In keeping with the theme of the panel, I'm going to ask a question about challenges, a question about opportunities. So first, the challenge, looking ahead the next year or so till, let's say, November 2020, what do you think the highest likelihood risk we face, the next risk we face is in the proliferation domain? And you can go in order or just whoever wants to answer. Go ahead.
Well, I would say it's further deterioration of the Iran deal. I mean, if it stays where it is now, we've made our point, the Iranians have made their point, the Europeans are trying to be helpful. It's tolerable until, let's say, a new administration comes in here. Things may even change with the departure of John Bolton, conceivably, so we'll have to see. But I'd say that is where the danger is, and it's not entirely clear within Iran, who's driving the process. I mean, why was there such an attack on the Saudi facilities? It seems like it was disproportionate to the kind of tit-for-tat that was going on with various vessels being detained, or with sanctions on the one hand and incremental changes in the nuclear deal on the other. This was really, an act of war, pure and simple, if it can be traced back to the Iranians. And so I think that's where I see the biggest challenge. And with North Korea, things are pretty bad, and there almost is nowhere to go but up. So I'm a little more sanguine, if that's comparatively speaking.
So the good news is people use this phrase, countries like Iran and North Korea. There are no other countries like Iran and North Korea. There are no other countries that we're worried are sort of right at the threshold of a breakout capability or have a nuclear weapons program we're trying to sort of scale back. But there could be. And the thing that's, I think, most in danger is the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which is really the glue that holds the entire arms control and nonproliferation regime together and has stemmed the sort of tide of proliferating states. In May of 2020, states parties to the NPT will gather in New York for the review conference, And it doesn't usually get on the front page of the news here, but this is a really critical time. And a lot of the states' parties who are going to be there are going to have major criticisms for the nuclear weapon states in attendance, who under the treaty have their own obligations to pursue in good faith. That's the actual, in the treaty text, in good faith, disarmament, processes to move towards disarmament and eventually a nuclear weapons-free world. Those countries haven't seen a lot from the United States and Russia, who have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. In fact, they've seen a backslide with the INF treaty collapsing, as to now the lack of extension of the New START treaty. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Proliferation and disarmament are really two sides of the same coin. And if countries see that nuclear weapon states are not backing off, are backing off of their own disarmament commitments, they're going to start to doubt the viability of the system that we've created that's kept us safe for the past 50 years. So I would see that as being countries like Iran and North Korea may come about if we allow the NPT to be further eroded.
Frankly, of course I'm concerned about both Iran and North Korea and the nuclear nonproliferation front. But I'm more worried about India-Pakistan, which is not a topic for this discussion, but that's already a hot conflict that could easily descend into further conflict, and both, as we know, have nuclear weapons. But so that's my vote. What really irritates me about where we're at today is a lot of the missing opportunities because of the current administration's stance, which is unorthodox and in a lot of ways nonsensical. In the case of Iran, I think if we had stuck with the nuclear deal, we probably would be well into a discussion with the Iranians now on extending those sunsets. I think we'd be in a discussion with them about ending the war in Yemen, which would be a pretty damn good thing right about now. The biggest humanitarian crisis on the planet. I think maybe we would have a seat at the table where the political future of Syria is now being determined, and we're not there. It's the Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians having a say in all that. Those are the sorts of missed opportunities I see. In the case of North Korea, I also see missed opportunities. I never was under the illusion that we would get to a grand bargain with them quickly on their nuclear program. But in talks I've had with the North Koreans, they said that they were willing and ready to discuss their chemical and biological weapons programs and provide assurances that they would not sell or give that technology to any third parties. I think that's a discussion worth pursuing at an official level. I think ending the Korean War after 70 years is a discussion worth pursuing, and how to get to an official treaty to end it. So for me, the frustration is these opportunities that are being missed. We're not really doing diplomacy. It's faux diplomacy, what's happening, and that irritates me too.
Okay, well, and that's a great segue to the next question, which is, given the realities that we're facing today, what would be the single policy or initiative that you'd recommend to strengthen the nonproliferation regime? This could either be something for the U.S. to do, or this would be something for the international community to do. But what would be something we could do that could make a difference in the near term?
Well, I guess I had identified a couple of things, and they really, one is this additional protocol that really has emerged by and large as the new standard for inspections. And it needs to be universalized. We've got a couple of holdouts right now, the key one being Saudi Arabia, Egypt kind of in the background as well. So that really needs to be embraced as a standard because it has such utility in so many different settings, especially if we imagine that there will be pressures in a country like Turkey or some of the others to move toward nuclear weapons. You want these inspections to really have more bite. Another development that came out of the Iran deal, which it's a little technical, But a lot of agreements that we have around the world with countries in the civil nuclear area, and that other seller states, other supplier states have, permit the enrichment of uranium, in some cases, up to a level of 20%, which of course is not weapon grade. But we've learned in the Iran case that it's close enough. And if a country has an enrichment capability and then has a stockpile of 20% enriched uranium, that is not good. That gives a very rapid breakout potential. So I think there are elements like that. They're a little bit of piecemeal, but each one an important strengthening of the system. I think would be very helpful.
It's hard to pick just one thing. I worked a lot on the New START treaty when I was at the State Department, so that's usually my go-to is extend the New START treaty. But it's really bigger than this. If I could just have one thing, it would be leaders need to get their heads in the game here. We were lucky to escape the Cold War without total and complete catastrophe. I don't think we can go back to basically rehashing, Cold War tactics, sliding back into an arms race, and just assume we will make it out again. The history is there behind us. We've been down this road towards, building up weapons, building up arsenals. We are tempting a fate that we cannot possibly handle. And that's why leaders, it's not a sometime thing when you just show up at the RevCon or give a speech at the first committee, which will happen next week up in New York. It's an all the time thing. Arms control and nonproliferation, managing the nuclear threat has to be something that has leader level attention in every single country in this world.
My answer is not technical, it's more political. I think the greatest thing the United States can do to strengthen the nonproliferation regime is to stick to our agreements. Plain and simple. Not tear them up, build on them. Arms control, nonproliferation agreements are always imperfect. They're the result of compromise, painstaking diplomacy that usually take years. And to discard it so nonchalantly sends the wrong signal to the world that it's not a priority for us. Even the INF Treaty give up so easily on that when we really could have fought for it and tried to build on it. And the lack of real political will to get started on a New START agreement, I think, is also another. So I think having the political will to stick to your agreements, show that you stand by them, that the United States' signature on an agreement counts for something.
Great. So we've covered a lot of ground, but there's plenty more to talk about. So I invite you to come up to one of the microphones on the left or right side of the room, and feel free to ask a question for one of the panelists. And please introduce yourself and your affiliation before you ask your question.
So my name is George Hutchinson, and I'm a PhD student here at the Shar School. Also the managing editor for the International Journal of Korean Studies. Obviously very interested on Korean issues. Totally share your concerns and totally agree with everything that you laid out on the North Korean issue. The one thing that I wanted to ask you about, though, is timing. Kim Jong-un in Hanoi, and then afterward, Kim Jong-un made it pretty clear that he gave Trump kind of a deadline. That a deal would have to be made. What he's told his internal audience in North Korea is that it's sanctions really that he's trying to angle and get from the Trump administration. On the U.S. side, even if Trump were to say, okay, I'm going to do a sanction, he really can't, because you've got UN sanctions that are bottled up in the UN, but then you've got U.S. sanctions where we're precluded by our own laws. We can't loosen those sanctions unless North Korea adheres to a checklist of mandatory things, including human rights, which have been left off the table entirely. So, with the window, it's October almost, so winter's coming. Is there an off-ramp or a face-saving thing that could happen, or has the administration totally pushed itself into
Well, I'll take that. And I got the winter is coming reference. I just started watching Game of Thrones. I think I'm the last person on earth that finally is watching it. You're right. The North Koreans have said they're giving the Trump administration till the end of the year to come to its senses, as they say. I think they said it more rudely, actually. But this is a scenario that I could see. They've given this deadline, and then what? Knowing the North Koreans, they're going to do something provocative. We'll have Kim Jong-un's big New Year's speech. Trump has said the red line is an ICBM test. Will they dare do something like that? And then how will Trump react? We could see us getting into an escalatory path. Let's avoid that. On the issue of sanctions, I have to disagree with you. We can do a lot with sanctions through waivers, limited waivers. For example, the South Koreans, our allies, asked us to give waivers so that North and South can resume joint economic projects. We said no, which I think was not a good idea. I think that was a miscalculation. Keep in mind, we're talking about the U.S. North Korea, but the U.S. North Korea and South Korea have been engaged in a reconciliation process, a peace process that was really moving forward at warp speed. Resulted in a lot of good things along the border, demining, demilitarization. That has come to a halt because our dialogue has come to a halt. And I think moving forward on the joint economic projects would have helped that process, while at the same time been a concession we give to the North Koreans to move this dialogue forward. So on the issue of sanctions, yes, there's the UN sanctions and all of that, but keep in mind that the North and South did a joint survey project to do a combined railroad, and the UN provided a waiver of sanctions for them to carry it out. So we can do this, and it's actually a good approach because we're not dropping the sanctions altogether. We don't want to do that because we haven't tested the North Koreans yet. But this sort of selective sanctions relief through temporary mechanisms, temporary waivers, is something we can do now.
Yes, my name is Justine Capone. I'm an international security study student here at Charter School. More medium term, obviously we had a huge non-proliferation victory in the 90s, getting Ukraine and these others to give up the nuclear weapons, for an agreement that would protect their territorial boundaries. Russia signed it too. Mind you, I've been throughout Eastern Europe, and I think the Russians are just kind of getting started and chomping on the bit of moving, But it's an interesting scenario because these states which did have nuclear weapons no longer do, and they're going up against a state that does. And honestly, I don't think we have Ukraine's back or any of these other states, even though some of them are treaty allies. So what do you think in terms of medium term, the situation is going to be over the next 10, 20 years?
So one, they weren't their nuclear weapons. Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus had Soviet nuclear weapons on their territory. It wasn't a matter of them just saying, oh, these are ours now. That could have blown up into a full-scale war at the time. The Lisbon Protocol was added to the START Treaty to sort of manage this. Those nuclear weapons did go back to Russia. Many of which oddly got blended down through a project called Megatons to Megawatts. At one point, I think 1 out of every 10 light bulbs on the East Coast was powered by a former Soviet nuclear weapon. I think it's kind of cool. But after the invasion, and I like to be able to say invasion, when I was at State Department, we could only say annexation because invasion has legal terms for the US government. After Russia invaded Ukraine and illegally annexed Crimea, the very next opportunity at the RevCon in 2014, Ukraine affirmed that they were right to have given up or transferred those nuclear weapons. They said out loud in front of everybody, we gave up those on purpose. It was the right thing to do. We do not regret it. And they've repeated that many, many times before they go into like a 30-minute rant about Russia. But Ukraine has not publicly said that they made the wrong choice there. The way the legal justification has gone is that the U.S. was, obligated to consult over matters if the territorial integrity of those countries was violated. I don't think we've been doing the best job consulting. It's a complicated matter that we need to be working with our European partners. I don't think we've been doing that very well, particularly as the current White House seems to be more comfortable criticizing our European allies. But it's a problem we're going to need to manage, and it is about keeping our word. And our situation and relationship with Ukraine just got a lot more complicated in the last week or so. But it is incumbent upon the US government and Congress to be making sure that we are keeping our eye on that situation and not just sort of accepting the idea that, okay, Russia has done this and we're just going to let them get away with it, because there are concerns about where does it go next? Is Belarus next on that list? Are the Baltic states next on that list? Which is why I think the European Reassurance Initiative under the Obama administration was so important, and why I'm very disappointed that the Trump administration has actually removed money from the ERI to pay for the wall. So I don't know how we simultaneously say we're there for our allies in Europe when we're taking money out of the very thing that was there to reassure them for Russian aggression in the region.
I just want to add two things on that. First, the weapons that were in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, those countries had no ability to support and keep and maintain those weapons once the Soviet Union fell apart. So the negotiations on their removal were in that context where these things were a wasting asset for those countries. It's not like Ukraine has automatically become a nuclear weapon state overnight. The second thing is, as we've seen in South Asia, between India and Pakistan, and now we've seen in other cases, nuclear weapons, are good for deterring some things, like large-scale cross-border conventional invasions. They're not good at deterring, proxy actors and the little green men and the kind of the hybrid warfare that we see going on in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And so that needs to be kept in mind when there are some who've said, oh, Ukraine made a mistake giving up their nuclear weapons, but even if they had got those weapons, which they couldn't have, they still would not have helped them in the scenario of what happened in the context of Crimea. So even though nuclear weapons do have a deterrent value, it is only deterring some kind of behavior and not everything. So just something else to keep in mind. Okay. Yep.
Hi, Sebastian Descuso. I'm an international security master's student. So we talked a lot about Trump and about the administration and reneging on deals and saying a different foreign policy precedent in the United States. How much of those actions, as tied to our reputation, is actually tied to our rep as a country and not to this administration reputation? Would a change in the administration lead to reopening doors that have been closed, like the case of Norway and North Korean dictator?
Would it?
That's a good question.
Absolutely. I think a change of administration would, will lead. If that was the thrust of the question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clear that there would be an effort to pull together, salvage as much as we could of the Iran deal. It might be. I think there'd be a readiness to negotiate with more flexibility on our side with the North Koreans, and I think that would be sort of a natural expectation on the other sides, the Iranians and the North Koreans, and I think it would unfold, fairly quickly. At least serious talks that would have more substance to them than what we've got right now. It may be hard, however, having laid down the rule that we sanction countries that engage in the hostilities that Iran is engaging in through proxies in the Middle East, to sort of undo that. There'd be criticism of an administration. But I think that's still where we would wind up because we had a success with that earlier strategy.
Yeah, there's nothing to stop this administration from deciding to change course. Reagan was much less friendly to arms control in his first term than he was in the second. So hope springs eternal. My concern is that no matter what we do, we'll always be a country that pulled out of the JCPOA. that pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. So we could always be a country that could do it again. And so, actions have consequences. I don't go to a Russian track 2 discussion without them throwing the withdrawal from ABM in our face. And I was like, well, I was in the Peace Corps at the time. This is not my responsibility. But they will never let it go, even if I don't even think they want a new ABM treaty. So yeah, you have to work with, unfortunately, what has happened before and sort of take account for that in your diplomatic strategies and just know that you're going to take hits.
I think all of the major Democratic candidates, or leading, I should say, have already committed to going back, returning to the JCPOA. One candidate says on day one, which I agree with. But they also look ahead and say they would also start negotiations on the range of other issues, particularly in the region, which I think is important for us to get to with the Iranians. When I think about the damage it's done to our reputation, one of the things that most concerns me, I think that was the thrust of your question, is the damage it's done to our reputation with our closest European allies. And particularly in the case of Iran, where, yes, we reimpose sanctions on the Iranians, but we also impose secondary sanctions on our closest European friends. And essentially gave them a choice. You either do business with us or you do business with the Iranians. And it doesn't get talked about very often, but in my conversations with European officials, the Iran deal was not just a non-proliferation agreement for them, or it isn't just a non-proliferation agreement. They really see it as an agreement that really gets to the heart of some serious security issues that they have. They are adjacent to the Middle East. They are the area where refugees flooding in from conflict in the Middle East happen. They do not want to see another conflict in the region and that to happen again. So as one European official said to me, we view what you've done as an unfriendly act. And diplomacy talk, that's serious. So I think regaining our reputation with the Europeans for a new president, if that happens in 2020, should be a priority.
Hi, I'm Dong-un Lee from Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute. My question about the definition of the North Korea's denuclearization. I think it is important to define the North Korea's denuclearization in order to move the negotiation forward. As you know, there are some definition of the North Korea's denuclearization, such as VVID, FFID, but this definition failed to move the negotiation forward, I think. How should we define North Korea's denuclearization to move the negotiation forward? Yes.
I guess there's no exact right way to do it. Definitions are important, and I think having a shared definition is the key. But the mechanics of that, I think fundamentally are just around North Korea, gives up the nuclear weapons it has or dismantles them under international observation, and there has to be a breakout time that is sufficient, at least equal to the kind of breakout time we're seeing, that the Iran deal put into place. So it would take, a year plus to be able to restart facilities. I think continuous monitoring at Pyongyang, which we have done in other negotiations before, would have to be a part of that deal, that we're not going to come look once and then never again. We're going to have to look for a while. You can never do anything for forever, which is, I think, came up in the Iran deal. Like, why didn't we have all these provisions forever? Because nobody agrees to anything forever. You agree to a length of time, and then you move from there and you build on the trust you've gotten. But yeah, I think the mechanics of denuclearization are more important than some definition I could come up with right here, right now. It's the agreement that's key.
Ellen had a comment?
Yes.
So a few of you have mentioned the kind of positive assurances that could be offered when you're trying to persuade a country that they don't really need nuclear weapons. If you're assuming that most countries, isolated, countries with no allies like North Korea and Iran, may think that nuclear weapons is the best defense because they don't have other security guarantees available to them. At the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we agreed to not invade Cuba. In the North Korea case, we've already suspended or at least slowed down exercises with the Republic of Korea. We perhaps have even considered, promising not to attack or to invade North Korea. I wonder if you could just draw on other historic examples of whether is the U.S. sometimes reluctant to give these assurances because we don't want to take anything, we don't want to limit our own options of whether this country could someday be a threat to us. But what is the track record on these kind of positive security assurances? Is that a tool that we know how to use smartly, or is it something that we're usually kind of conflicted about using?
I have to try to think of some previous cases. I only can look at it from the other side. We don't take, no offense, no first use pledges by foreign countries as reliable. And I think with North Korea, there's such a history of suspicion about the United States. I think pledging not to invade would be desirable, but it wouldn't do the job. There has to be a lot more. And I think it's probably economic assistance and relationship building and attempting to transform the North Korean economy and the way they just do business in the world to be more normal, that makes it much more credible that we would not invade. So I think there needs to be a combination. The pledge is something nice to put on the table, but I don't think it'll bring them around.
In the case of Iran, they described the process as a strategic decision they decided on their own when they looked in the neighborhood and realized that possessing nuclear weapons actually made them less secure, obviously opened them up to attack from Israel and others. So that's a decision they say they came to them on their own. And as I said in my presentation, there are some in Iran now that are questioning that decision. But I think it matters what kind of neighborhood you live in. I mean, in the case of North Korea, all the major powers there, previous speaker said Beijing is accepting of the status quo situation, more or less. That would not be the case in the Middle East, as you know. The other point in terms of assurances, when we look at the nuclear deal, I think it was critical during the secret negotiations that we were able to convey to the Iranians that we were not after regime change. That's a security assurance that they were looking for, and I think that helped make a move towards further negotiations. But that was a key part of the secret talks, is allaying their fears that we were actually after regime change.
I think we have time for one last question.
Can I ask a quick question? So some scholars have sort of argued that why not just live with the nuclear North Korea? And so I guess my question then is, say, for the worst case scenario, North Korea is going to remain nuclearized. Is there still room for maneuver with regard to non-proliferation, like moving the negotiations into sort of further controlling the North Korean nuclear program, et cetera, but sort of not focusing on denuclearization?
There's no question, I think that's where we're heading. Denuclearization is the aspirational goal. The actual negotiations will be looking at steps along the way. And I'd be very, very surprised if we get all the way home. But if there was a freeze and there was maybe certain elimination, shutdown of some of the facilities, no more missile tests, I mean, you could imagine something that wouldn't be what we would start out as our desire. It was like eliminating all enrichment in Iran. That was our going-in position. But you can't expect the administration, or any administration, to go in with a position, well, we'll take a halfway measure, what do you say? We need to start at least with trying to get all the way home And then as the negotiations proceed, perhaps accept, at least on an interim basis, some kind of partial improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. I think every one of those legally binding measures that we can get them into gets us into a better place, and then we can, get to the ultimate goal, which is getting them to fully eliminate their nuclear arsenal. And countries have given up nuclear weapons before, but never quite in this way. So it would be new. Doesn't make it impossible, but I don't think we should expect it tomorrow. And I think we're setting ourselves up for disappointment and possibly conflict if we're so insistent on getting everything all up front.
Yeah, I'm not ready to give up on denuclearization. I think, Kim Jong-un is an interesting person, isn't he? He's, he's in mid-30s. He's got probably, well, I don't know his health, but let's say maybe 5 decades ahead of him. He's moved the country from the Byung-chul policy, which was the simultaneous development of both the nuclear program and the economy, to strictly focusing on the economy now. How will he achieve those goals when he's under such tight sanctions? It's interesting because in my travels to North Korea, recently the talk of the economic development, and Kim Jong-un has been staking his credibility on it to the public, which is really a dynamic shift that I don't think we've seen before, like actually telegraphing to the North Korean people that this is my priority now and I'm going to deliver it for you. That's pretty remarkable. As a strategist, I think that gives us a lot of leverage, the United States, to negotiate and use that in talks with the North Koreans. The North Koreans are really fixated on changing the fundamental nature of the relationship between us and them. They see that as the way forward. And the fact is we really haven't tested them yet to see how far they can go. We don't know. I often think that maybe Kim Jong-un hasn't even decided himself how far he's willing to go with denuclearization. But I think we need to test it vigorously. We're still in a pre-negotiation stage, the way I look at it. We haven't even come close to the previous question determining how to define denuclearization. We're so far from these questions still. We still don't even have a direct channel of steady communication after all this time. So the fundamentals of negotiation are not in place yet. But I do think the process, framing the process, moving away from the current Trump administration approach of denuclearization first and then all else will follow, to denuclearization as the end goal, but we can make some important benchmarks along the way, is the approach we should be following.
All right, well, join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their expertise with us. And I understand that we're now breaking for our lunch in the outside, and then rejoining here at 1 o'clock. So see you all then.